Hello, welcome back to 1874. It's time for a very special show as I, Dan Bardell, am going to speak to French football expert Jonathan Johnson about Villa's two new loan signings even, Marco Asensio and Axel Disasi. Jonathan is a Villa fan. I don't know whether that is well known, whether people watching this are expecting Jonathan to be a Villa fan, but he is, which is a nice little quirk. But more importantly, he is a French football expert. And Jonathan, I was just saying before we came on, I don't actually know how you became a French football expert, but we should probably start with how did you become a Villa fan, actually?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me on. Absolute honour to finally make it onto the show. I think this is the first time.
I don't know why I've never done it before.
Exactly, I mean, the first time you and I collaborating over something that's not on Sky Sports. Obviously, a fellow Sky Sports reporter, but no, to be honest, this has been quite a long journey for me. Having grown up in Solihull, used to live sort of literally slap bang between Knoll and Dorridge. So anyone who went to Arden School will sort of know what used to kind of be my stomping ground up until like my around sort of 16, something like that. And at that moment, I moved to France with my family. And while living in the Parisian suburbs for 3 years before going back to the UK for university, I was looking for something to replace sort of the day-to-day football fandom that I was missing, having grown up being a Villa fan for years, having had a season ticket on the Holt End. And that's when I decided to get myself a PSG season ticket to replace my Villa one. And that was kind of the beginning of, I guess, my love story with French football and PSG to an extent, because a lot of people also know me as somebody who's worked the PSG beat for a long time, basically since they were taken over by the Qataris. But I was actually there at Parc des Princes sort of long before Qatar got their claws into PSG. And I think it's something for me that over time has kind of become, I've almost got these two different halves of my identity. I've got the English part of me, which bleeds claret and blue, and the French part of me, which kind of bleeds a bit of a darker shade of red and darker shade of blue. But no, it's Villa's always been close to my heart. A lot of the people here in Paris and on the Parisian football beats also know that my allegiances lie mainly with Villa, which will be interesting if Villa and PSG were to cross paths in the Champions League this year. It's really, really funny because when I've spoken publicly about my affinity, my fandom for Villa, people have always said to me, and this is going back more than 10 years, like, what if one day like Villa and PSG come up against each other? And I used to laugh it off because it just seemed so unfathomable that it would happen. And now suddenly, we're here, live this amazing Champions League adventure. I was in Monaco for the game a couple of weeks ago. Lovely to have a couple of people reach out and sort of have recognized me from doing stuff with Sky, and have sort of heard me talking about being a Villa fan before. And it's been amazing the last couple of years, sort of not only having Villa back in Europe, but to have had Villa coming to France a couple of times. Lille, that's a fixture that's steeped in a lot of history for me, because I remember from my season ticket days having Lille in the Intertoto Cup, which back then was a big deal.
I remember it.
The Champions League was only something that we could dream of. But now we're sort of here in the big time, and really making ourselves known. So it's a fantastic time to be a Villa fan. I'd be lying if I said that they'd all been easy. The last couple of years, following Villa from a distance has been quite tough, and sort of no longer sort of having family links with the West Midlands makes it getting back to Villa Park that bit trickier. But being able to follow Villa on the road, especially when they come to France, has been an absolute blessing for me, and has kept this relationship with Villa live and kicking, which for a while sort of, I know somebody popped into the comments the Remy Gard period of Villa. That was probably one of the most testing periods, sort of having to speak positively about what Remy Gard had done during his time in France, and then obviously seeing it go disastrously wrong on the pitch for Villa. So, fingers crossed that all of the future kind of French influence that we're going to be talking a little bit about today on the podcast is more positive than that was.
I mean, my biggest take What there is that I understand why you don't sound like me with your move into France at the stage that you did. It makes complete sense that you'd be a Villa fan, and not all Villa fans sound like me.
You know what though is really funny, because I've looked back on videos that my family have of us around that time, my family around that time, and if I had stayed in the area, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be sounding like this these days.
Well, it's probably helped you a lot in your career that you don't sound like me. Just before we get into the new players, Jonathan, David Stiles has just asked a question here, which I think is quite a good prevalent question. He's interested in what the broader French opinion is of Boubacar Kamara. Does he go under the radar there as well? I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, fantastic question, and I think just going back to when Villa landed him, it was a huge shock, because I think people underestimate, because they look at sort of the years of mediocrity that Marseille have had and think, they're not really a big club anymore. Marseille are a huge club in France. And I know it's a bit controversial for somebody, ostensibly very pro PSG to kind of come out and say that, but they are a massive club. They're still the only French club to have won the European Cup. So for Boubacar to have decided when he did, to leave and up sticks for Villa when Villa weren't in Europe, that was a huge shock, and it was viewed extremely negatively. I think there were a lot of people who looked at him and thought, well, he's writing off his potential to get into the France squad. Why is he essentially taking a step down? And I think the last couple of years, certainly last year in Europe and this year obviously in the Champions League, has kind of proven him correct in his decision to leave Marseille, because although Marseille have been in Europe since then, they haven't been at the same level that Villa have been at, and they're not consistently in Europe as well. So I do think that there are many people who are probably a little sore, because they know that they didn't obviously want Boubacar to leave, because he's such a huge talent, and we're seeing that now come to fruition in the Villa midfield. I think people forget as well just how adept he was at playing central defence as well, because I was looking at sort of our options dwindling as the clock ticked down on deadline day, and I was just wondering how many of the Villa fans actually realised that he was a very, very competent central defender when called upon in defence by Marseille, which is far more often than he has been at Villa so far, but for the better, because I think he's become an integral part of Villa's team, and I think when we've missed him through injury, he's been a huge miss, and I think unfortunately that kind of checkered history with injuries is what's cost him a little bit in terms of his development with the national team. Fingers crossed that the worst is behind him now, and he can sort of build towards the future in the 2026 World Cup and a potential place in that squad, possibly even in the starting 11, because if you look at the kind of transitional period that France are going through under Didier Deschamps, I think that Boubacar's perfectly placed to potentially be considered for that kind of role. I don't think that he is sort of substandard in any way to some of the players that are currently in the current pool of talent. And for me, I'd be really, really disappointed if in the next couple of years he hasn't worked up to the point where he is potentially maybe a starter for Les Bleus in North America in 2026. The only question, and obviously I don't really want to raise the prospect on here, is if he's still wearing claret and blue at that point.
Well, I think from what I've heard, the Duran sale will offset any need to shift Kamara in the summer, and you'd hope now, as a Villa fan, that new contract talks might be entered at some stage, because he's coming to 2 years left on his contract, or a year and a half. I can't. Is it 2027 his contract ends, or 2026? I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's imminent anyway. I can't even remember what year it is. I'm so tired at the moment from being so busy. But anyway, he hasn't got long left on his contract, so hopefully Villa will begin talks soon. In the dressing room, though, he's going to have a new French friend in the dressing room with him in Axel Disasi. Was very good for Monaco, went to Chelsea. It hasn't quite worked out for him, has been really on the fringes, on the periphery this season, just played mainly in the Conference League for Chelsea. How did he end up in this position, and how did he end up at Villa? What do you think's gone wrong for him?
I think what's gone wrong for Disasi is the same thing that's gone wrong for a number of players. I mean, even if you're just looking at the Chelsea defenders, there's a number of them who, I'm familiar with from their time in French football. Badiashile, for example, Fofana as well. And they've all had similar issues. They have joined a club which has not really shown any restraint when approaching the transfer market, let's just say, to keep it polite. They've been spending money sort of left, right and centre, and a bunch of players have sort of just been thrown into a squad, and Enzo Maresca is only just really making sense of it. I think it's really important to point out that Maresca said at the beginning of this season he had to make some really unpopular decisions, sort of focus on certain players and sort of cast aside some others. Although Disasi sort of wasn't cast aside as publicly as, say, a Raheem Sterling, he has obviously been marginalised in the last couple of months, and I think that is sort of the key reason that has led Disasi to Villa Park. But I do think that, during his time with Chelsea, he did have some good moments. And I think, Chelsea fans, I think, were a little bit spoiled for choice in terms of all of the talent that joined the team so quickly. It was almost like sort of like the Abramovich 2.0 era, where there was a new player coming through the door at Stamford Bridge every single day, and I think it's easy there to just to assume that if a player has a bad performance or hits a little bit of bumpy form, that there'll be one or two other different options that can be tried instead of them, and then suddenly the problem gets solved. I don't think that there was really sort of like a long-term chance given to a lot of the players in a similar position to Disasi, obviously including him as well. And I think obviously there's been injuries which have hampered the likes of Fofana, but I do think that the likes of Disasi, the likes of Badiashile, have really sort of not really been given a fair crack of the whip. I think you could have said the same for Chalobah as well, but I know that he got recalled, during this month. So it does look like ultimately he will probably have a better shot at establishing himself at Stamford Bridge. But he's a player, obviously, who spends a bit of time in Ligue 1 as well, despite not having sort of come up through the ranks over here in France. So I do think it's fascinating now to see what Disasi and Villa can potentially achieve between now and the end of the season, because obviously for him there's still potential for him to salvage his career with Chelsea, given that there's no real sort of option, at least in my understanding, in the deal to sort of buy him outright at the end of it at this moment in time. But I do think that if the relationship is good, you mentioned earlier, or you're sort of dancing around the topic of PSR. I think given that we look on paper like we're very well positioned ahead of this summer, obviously, second half of the season form permitting, if we're in a good spot and potentially back in Europe by the end of the season, negotiating for somebody like Disasi, should his loan spell, go as hoped, I think will be potentially really interesting for Villa. And I think as well, something that people underrate about Disasi is that he does have a bit of versatility about him as well. He's not just played in central defence, he has played at fullback as well. And I think, having somebody as solid as he is, potentially there to sort of slot in at right back as well, could be hugely important. So I'm really curious to see how he does. I think physically, he's absolutely, a shot in the arm for what Villa have needed in the defence in the last couple of weeks. It's been pretty horrific seeing our options dwindle, especially when Tyrone picked up that very, very worrying knock a couple of weeks ago. Thankfully, it's not as bad as it initially seemed by the sounds of it, but let's hope that he's sort of back on the pitch with regularity, and we've got one more defensive option that we can count on. But I do think that Disasi, in terms of the options that were being discussed towards the end of the window, in my opinion, was always sort of the first choice, and it's refreshing as well that he was so determined to make the move happen.
Yeah, what was it that got him to Chelsea in the first place then? For those who haven't watched much of him at Monaco, and he's a France international as well, what was it during that time that got him that big money move to Chelsea and kind of put him in the spotlight to begin with?
So I think the thing that you really need to bear in mind with Monaco is there's not really any kind of longevity for any of the players with the Monaco project, because you don't really, and many Villa fans will be familiar with this now, having gone there a couple of weeks ago, with no real sort of hardcore following in Monaco itself at Stade Louis II. It's very difficult for the club to rely on match day revenue in the same way that their French rivals do. Obviously, they get a massive benefit financially, by the players essentially earning wages tax-free. But it is a very, very difficult for a player to really spend the entirety of their career. It's an excellent place, though, to essentially put yourself in the shop window, to get a bit of a taste of European football, and to constantly be playing for a team that normally is competing in the top half of the table for European positions. And I think Disasi is somebody who caught the eye of Monaco when performing very well for Reims, who historically are sort of a lower half of the table to mid-table side, who enjoyed a good bit of form around the time that Disasi was playing well for them. Obviously caught Monaco's eye, moves there, and then becomes sort of a cornerstone of that team at the time with further consistent performances. That kind of got him on the verges of the France squad, but he recognised that he needed a move to potentially a league that was best suited for him and his ability to potentially finally make that breakthrough. Ultimately, he did by going to Chelsea, and initially it did seem to be sort of a good fit, and that he'd be kind of a regular potentially in the starting 11 there. But obviously, we know what has happened since, and Chelsea signing 4 or 5 different players to compete for the same position was always going to limit game time. So I don't think it's necessarily a reflection of the fact that he hasn't kicked on as hoped. I think it's unfortunately circumstances as well. And had he potentially gone somewhere else, he might be in a position where he'd be a lot happier, sort of with his game time and probably more of a regular feature in the French national team at this moment in time. But that's obviously going to be the goal for him now coming to Villa, to win back that position, ahead of the potential start of the 2026 World Cup qualification cycle, really getting himself into the reckoning for that, like Boubacar.
Yeah, and we've seen Luca Dean get his place back in the French squad, haven't we, in kind of the last 12 months or so by his body of work at Villa. So it's not unheard of that can happen. It's, again, my understanding and from reading things, that Emery really wanted a centre-back that could play right back. So kind of reading between the lines there, he doesn't want to move Ezri Konsa to right back. He likes to build up with his back three, but Ezri Konsa's best position, I think we can all agree, is in the centre of that back three when Villa are building up. So you'd imagine by signing Disasi, they're going to be able to do this now. What would you say are his kind of standout attributes to be able to perform that role?
Well, I mean, I think he's an extremely solid defender, whether he's played centrally, whether he's played at right back. When you look at him, physically, he's a very difficult player to get past, difficult to beat in a foot race as well. I mean, obviously, he doesn't have the kind of technicality, that you'd come to expect from a Torres. But obviously, we know that if he's fit and can be on the pitch, Mings can kind of replicate that a little bit, especially sort of being the left-sided, of the central defenders. So Disasi, I think, is certainly going to bring a lot more consistency and a physical presence, sort of in that central to right-sided defensive block. It'll be interesting to see if he's preferred sort of as the right-sided of potentially 3 central defenders, or if he is just slotted in at right back immediately. Obviously, when he's played at right back, you don't sort of get the same attacking output, that you would do from somebody like a Dean or somebody like a Matson. But obviously, that's very difficult to do when the guy's on the right, when it's not Cash, Konsa, or potentially Disasi, as we're having this conversation. So, I think for me, I can see him probably fitting in best as a central defensive option. And I think the good thing about it is as well, it gives Mings, time to, work himself back into, potentially being ready to start again, instead of feeding that pressure to get back on the pitch, having had a very near brush with what would have been a really, catastrophic reoccurrence of, what's been an awful injury for him for the last couple of years. And I think having that peace of mind is hugely important, because it really did feel like we were threadbare in defence a week or so ago. And, like I was saying, I was just wondering exactly how long it was going to take before potentially, Buba was going to be shifted back into the defence, because ultimately, to me, if a central defender wasn't coming in, that was going to be the option that made the most sense to me. But now we've avoided that. I think that's a huge boost, because obviously it keeps him in the midfield doing what he does best. And ultimately what I believe to be his best position, despite having seen him for a number of years in central defence in France. And I think it's, this is a really good pickup for Villa, and I think ultimately makes the difference between what could have been quite an underwhelming January transfer window, and actually one that Villa fans can feel quite positive about now, because I think in terms of central defence, and what I said about Mings as well goes for Torres as well. Not rushing those guys back, from injury, or at least expecting them to start until they're absolutely ready to. I think is a huge boost for Unai Emery, especially going into the second half of the season when, there's a lot to still feel optimistic for. I know sort of in terms of consistency has not quite been what we've hoped for so far, especially in terms of league form. But, the fact that we're still in with a shout at the FA Cup, I know there's a huge game coming up against Spurs soon, and also, still being in the Champions League and potentially being within reach of a potential quarter-final berth. It's fantastic times. And it's, I think if it felt like when I was at the game at Monaco, maybe some fans, I wouldn't say had sort of lost sight of that. But, I think we do need to sort of pinch ourselves and, take stock of things now that the January transfer window is closed. And, try to look at things for the second half of the season with a bit more positivity, even if there have been some performances and results recently, which, I can understand have fostered a little bit of pessimism and negativity.
Yeah, Villa have definitely been capable of dropping a stinker of a half or two, more so this season than last season. I've said that in plenty of places now. In the short term, I think Mings will be back possibly for Sunday. Not too sure yet, but I don't think he'll be too far away. Disasi can't play on Sunday because he's cup tied. He's played for Chelsea in the FA Cup already. If he needed to for a sustained period or for a short period, we've seen that Emery's very reluctant to play a right footer at left centre back. Could Disasi play there, or would that be a struggle for him? Because I've got to be honest, when I have watched him for Chelsea, I have felt that on the ball he doesn't always look comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to say that Disasi would be able to replicate sort of what Torres and what Mings are capable of doing. To me, the logical fit in that kind of scenario, and I know he's not had the best start to life at Villa Park, but I was a bit surprised to see Dean sort of slotting in as the central defender instead of having Maatsen there. But I would actually go with someone like Maatsen, who we'd seen a little more centrally last season with Dortmund, when he played sort of a very deep defensive midfield role. If you really want to sort of replicate that kind of left-footed, potentially ball-playing, central defender, I would probably go with Maatsen over somebody like Disasi. And, I think really what this all reflects is that Emery is very reluctant to move Konsa when fit and on the pitch, because obviously, he is kind of the rock-like presence that the defence is built around. So, yeah, I would expect to see Disasi kept on the right side of the defence. But regardless, he's not that kind of ball-playing defender. He's very much there to be sort of the physical presence, very, very difficult to be, quite dominant, and an aerial threat hopefully from corners as well, as we've seen already from his time at Chelsea.
Yeah, and just finally on Disasi, what do you think it is that's attracted him to come to Villa Park? Because he turned down Spurs by the sound of things. He sounded very, very keen to come to Villa and kind of waited it out on deadline day. It was looking a bit ropey at certain stages, but in the end, kind of Villa won that poker match, and Disasi has come over. What do you think it is that's appealed to him? Is it the fact that they're in the Champions League, or although we still don't know who's going to make the squad for the registration period of the Champions League, or is it just that he'll back himself to get more football there, purely and simply?
I mean, I think it's a mix of things. I mean, something else that I think is thrown into the mix, and I know sort of Chelsea fans were sort of dismissing it towards the end of the transfer window as not really being important, but I think it was important to Disasi not to sort of cross the divide in London as well. I think he's quite a respectful guy. I don't think he really sort of wanted to potentially burn his bridges, for the future. I think there had to be an element of pragmatism there. Also, I don't really see how there's too many players who can be looking, with all due respect to Spurs at this moment in time. And I know that this has potential to backfire catastrophically with the FA Cup coming up at the weekend. So fingers crossed, touch wood, that's not the case. But there's less going on at Spurs at this moment in time that I think makes a player really want to sort of get involved there. It's, for example, if Disasi was to have made that decision and to have rejected Villa instead, what happens then if Postecoglou potentially, gets fired?
Yeah,
maybe not sort of after the EFL Cup second semi-final, but after this weekend. I know that we don't have the best record in the FA Cup of late in the early stages, but if they were to go out at the weekend as well, suddenly if Postecoglou leaves, what was proposed, a week, 2 weeks before, no longer applies. So, Disasi could also find himself, potentially, on the substitutes bench for the rest of the season. Whereas, I think he recognised that there was an absolute need for somebody of his profile to come in and really, boost the options that we have at Villa Park, but also potentially play a fairly significant role in the Champions League as well. I think he would have looked at sort of the opportunities that Diego Carlos was given over the last couple of months, despite Villa fans knowing, very well that, he was potentially on the outs, and will fancy himself to, make a good impression with those kind of minutes. And I think as well, when people look at Premier League clubs that have achieved a lot in the last couple of years, Villa are right at the top of that list now. People want to work for Unai Emery and want to work with Unai Emery. And Disasi will remember going up against, Unai Emery sides. It was a long time ago now, but, in its very, very early days in Ligue 1, and Unai Emery will be familiar with Disasi as well from his time in Ligue 1. So there already is sort of a recognition that the two have sort of seen what they can do sort of outside of English football, and now there's potentially, an opportunity to work together. And I think when people get the opportunity to work with Emery now, a little bit like Marcus Rashford as well, it's something that really excites some of these players, and they relish, being able to potentially be a part of what's been put together the last couple of years in Birmingham.
Yeah, so let's move on from Disasi then. Let's stay with someone who's come directly from Ligue and then Marco Asensio. How have we ended up here? How is this player that's played for Real Madrid, that's at PSG? How has he ended up at Villa Park? I mean, I'm talking like it's a massive step down, and obviously in our eyes, it's not. He's coming to one of the best clubs that there is, because we're both Villa fans. But once you play for those two teams, not many players have made the journey of playing for them to be at Villa.
Yeah, that's true, and I think as well, if we cast our minds back, Villa fans with a fairly long memory will also recall that Villa were in the hunt for Asensio's signature before he ultimately decided to go to PSG. Now, obviously, what we know since then is it's not really kind of worked out for Asensio with PSG. I think that has, many Villa fans are understandably asking questions about what exactly, he kind of brings to the mix for the second half of the season. And I'd love to say that I know exactly, what he's potentially bringing, but, there is an element of chance to this. It is a bit of a risk. It would surprise me if he was the player that didn't potentially make the list for the Champions League, but also at the same time, if you're looking at sort of the players that Villa have brought in this month, I'd be stunned if one of Rashford or Disasi was overlooked. So I guess that kind of puts Asensio at least in kind of third position. And again, I'd be surprised if Malin as well was left off of that list. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see when the official list is confirmed. But going back to Asensio, he's a really, really difficult player to pin down and be absolutely certain about. He is, when you see him play, there's absolutely no doubt when you look at his technique, you look at what he's capable of on the ball, he is not a poor player. Yet when you look at that technique and then you find yourself struggling to understand, what his best position is, which I think is something that he's kind of struggled with over the last couple of years under Luis Enrique in Paris. It's not clear where his best position is on the pitch anymore. I know people from his time at Real Madrid would remember him as a wide man, but he's essentially been forced to play as a false nine for PSG for the entire time at Parc des Princes so far. And he is not really cut out for that. He had a very good start with a couple of goals very early on in his PSG career and then picked up an injury. That's obviously one thing that Villa will have to be extremely wary of. He does get injured fairly easily. So hopefully he has a clean bill of health for the next couple of months. But, I think the one thing that I can get quite excited about that he potentially brings to the mix of Villa that not many players do have at this moment in time is he has immense Champions League experience. Obviously, he hasn't used too much of that with PSG in the last couple of months. But when you bear in mind sort of what he'd done with Real Madrid, the fact that Emery knows his game probably better than most Premier League coaches, the fact that he feels that there's something there he can potentially dig into, which I would have to feel is probably in a wide position as opposed to being in a false nine position. leads me to feel slightly optimistic about it, even if I wouldn't have bet, when the transfer window was opening, that Villa would go in and go for Asensio based on form that we've seen at PSG in the last couple of months.
Quite a weird one, this, but I think actually if in games where Disasi plays at right back, I wouldn't expect to see Asensio start. But if Matty Cash is playing, we've seen at times this season, Villa have played with kind of 3 number 10s. Do you think the fact that Villa can play with 3 10s, can always have at least 2 number 10s in their lineup, do you think that will help him in terms of positioning?
I do. I think the more attack-minded that Villa are, the more that Asensio can potentially, bring to the mix. Also, I think, if we're sort of looking at breaking into Villa's starting 11 at this moment in time, it's difficult to see how he immediately walks into the starting 11. So you'd have to imagine that he's sort of there on the bench, potentially an option that Emery can bring in and possibly, try and put a bit of pressure on, maybe one of the more underperforming elements of the regular starting 11, cough, Leon Bailey, something like that. And I think it's, he brings this kind of interesting kind of like wildcard element, because like I added, he's not a poor player. He's blessed with very, very good technique. It just doesn't quite have that consistency. But Emery has shown over his career that he is able to get those kind of difficult kind of characters to channel some of their best form, string together sort of 2-3 convincing performances instead of having sort of, 1 or 2 good performances out of 10 games, sort of dotted around all over the place. And I do think that, I can understand the people who say Asensio is kind of a luxury player, and to many extents and purposes he is, but I think he is a luxury player who now gives us something that we haven't had for the last couple of months, which is a bit of a threat from the bench to the players in the starting 11, which logically should improve the form of the players ahead of them in the starting 11, and if it doesn't, then they can potentially move their way up the pecking order, and maybe that's what will happen with Asensio. But I don't see him immediately walking into the starting 11, unless obviously Emery wants to do something extremely experimental and try and see how all the new signings look in more or less the same game, which, given that it's Spurs in the FA Cup, I think would be a bit of a risk given our sort of cup hopes for the season. But, I do think as well, with the Champions League in mind, what he brings away from the pitch will be almost as important, if not more important, than what he could actually potentially bring on the pitch. Because I think having somebody with that kind of experience, if we want to really make a shot of getting to the quarterfinals, I think could really make the difference.
Yeah, I think it's that technical ability that excites me from what you've said. If you look at players that do play number 10 for Villa, they're not stereotypical number 10s. If you think of like Ramsey, Rodgers, McGinn when he plays there, the more players that will carry the ball and try and progress the ball that way. It's that technique, and at times when you can't break a side down, having a player like that to come on and play against a low block, or someone who can just put their foot on the ball and pick out a pass. I think Villa have lacked that option at number 10 this season.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Also, I think the other thing to keep in mind is Villa will be getting an extremely motivated player who feels like he hasn't really been given a fair crack of the whip by Luis Enrique in recent months. And even though if you spoke to sort of PSG regulars, they'd say that Asensio hasn't really done enough in the minutes that he's been given to justify sort of being given, even more time to prove himself. He is a player who I think, when motivated and sort of wanting to prove himself, is capable, of those kind of moments of magic that you mentioned. And, feels like there's been fewer of those so far this season for Villa. And, if Emery is insisting personally that he feels that he can get something out of, a player like Asensio, then, I think it made sense that Villa at least tried to get him. And now that he's there, ultimately it's going to give Emery another option to potentially shake things up, which I think could really be critical in terms of determining what happens over the second half of the season for us, because it's clear that if things continue to go the way that they've gone in the first half of the season, there is a big risk that Villa aren't on the continental stage next season because other teams will have performed better.
With Asensio and probably with Rashford as well, I don't know whether you think the same as me, but I felt Emery's looked visibly frustrated in the last month or so, and almost having these two like because Rashford and Asensio are big name players who've played at the highest level for a long time. I kind of feel that those signings will reinvigorate Emery a little bit. Not that he needs a massive amount of reinvigoration, but do you get what I mean? I think it will excite him, and him getting his hands on players who potentially can genuinely be top class. I think it kind of will get something extra out of Emery. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think, Rashford certainly is a huge challenge for Emery now, because even sort of at this stage last season, I think people were really struggling to see whether Rashford would really make the move away from United, given sort of the symbolism that somebody like him has at Old Trafford. And then, potentially, for his first stop post United to be with Villa, I think that's a huge challenge for Emery, and that's going to be massively motivating for him. And like you said, having somebody of Asensio's class as well, turning up at Villa Park is potentially rewarding for Emery, who, let's not forget, wanted him a couple of years ago when he ultimately opted to go to PSG instead. So there is very clearly something in his profile that he likes, and that Emery sees that he can potentially tap into, that nobody has been able to do with regularity over the last couple of years. So I definitely think there's an element of challenge that's really going to motivate Emery for the second half of the season. But like you said, I don't think he necessarily looks short of motivation right now. I think he was perhaps sort of calling out for the tools with which to motivate those players and get the best out of them. And with these changes made to the squad, I think he'll feel more confident now, that he's able to get the kind of performances that he's craving from this Villa side over the second half of the season, to what we've seen over the first half of the season. And something else I'd add as well, I know sort of that I took a bit of a shot at Leon Bailey earlier, but I'd say, coming up off the back of last season, I actually thought that this season would be a lot harder, specifically for individual players. Now, I didn't expect Yuri to have stepped up in the way that he has, with such regularity to replace Douglas Luiz. But I really felt like Douglas Luiz and Bailey at the end of last season, when I saw them up close in Lille, I had a really bad feeling that it was going to be difficult for them to sort of relaunch themselves into this season, and it was always going to be a bit tricky with them. It's proven to be the case with Bailey. Obviously, we know that Villa went on to sell Douglas Luiz, and sort of we can now look back on that cherished history together. But I think had Douglas Luiz still been around and Villa potentially had sold somebody else, I think maybe the problems would have been more extensive than they already have been so far this season. But it does feel like it's a matter of time, really, before Emery potentially has to draw a line under being able to rely on Bailey as a regular member of the starting 11, because he's had to, because there haven't really been that many alternatives of late. But now that he does have a bit of depth available to him, it does feel like, I'm not going to say Bailey's on borrowed time, but it does feel like he's the obvious member of the sort of regular starting 11 of late, who could potentially drop out and be replaced by a Rashford, or potentially an Asensio.
Yeah, I mean, there was discussions about him leaving in January, so I think you're right to call out that he is probably the most vulnerable at the moment. I think Asensio, is, out of all of them, is the one that definitely intrigues me the most out of the signings that the Villa have made. He feels like the kind of player that would have gone to Emery at Sevilla or Villarreal, and Emery would have turned him into a world beater. I'm just hoping that translates into the Premier League with Villa. I asked you a similar question about Disasi, like what's his standout attribute, but can I ask you that? And also, AVFC said here, he's asked whether Asensio will handle the physicality here. So what's Asensio's kind of standout quality that you think he'll bring to Villa? And also, will he handle the physicality? Because I guess players who of that ilk, that's always the question that's thrown at them when they come into English football.
I mean, I think if you're looking at Asensio and if you're expecting a really physical player, I mean, I think it'll be quite clear quite quickly. The strengths in his game are not based around the physicality, but that doesn't mean that he's not suited to Premier League football. I think he is capable of playing, football at a fast pace, which obviously, is absolutely necessary if you're going to be a success in the Premier League. And I think also you've got to look at the quality, the level of which he's been playing at in the last, couple of years. He's been a regular in the Champions League. You don't play year upon year of Champions League football if you're somebody who has, obvious major, physical or technical vulnerabilities. So he's definitely a technique-based player, but somebody who's used to playing extremely fast. And I think, will be looked at as potentially an accelerator of the play when he's on the pitch for Villa, as opposed to somebody who, is going to make himself felt physically on the pitch. So is there potential for him to get roughed up a little bit? Yes, but I think, there's always going to be that sort of baptism of fire element to a player coming to the Premier League for the first time. But I think his technique, once he gets on the ball, will certainly allow him to sort of maneuver himself out of many tricky situations.
And just finally, in the Asensio mold, before I ask you something else, out of all the signings Villa have made in January, which is the one that excites you the most? Which is the one you're picking out as your favourite signing?
Well, it's funny because we've spent this episode talking about the players who have spent time in France, but I have to be honest, I know there's been a wave of kind of negativity surrounding Rashford leaving United, mainly from sort of United fans feeling that, it's been sort of a promise unfulfilled. But having somebody like Rashford, joining Villa and potentially looking to rekindle his career at Villa Park, I think that's huge. That's really, really exciting. Fingers crossed that he can do it, and that Emery can work his magic with him. Because I think if we were able to help to rejuvenate Rashford, whether or not it's something that sort of lasts beyond the end of the season, I think it has the potential to be really special and possibly define the second half of the season for Villa. I'm not saying that our hopes for this campaign are going to live and die by what happens with Rashford, but I think being able to bring in such a big name and such a potentially huge talent, because on his day he can be phenomenal. I think it's massively exciting for Villa, and just hopefully it was the right roll of the dice in January, and ultimately come the end of the season, you and I are celebrating over a cold beer somewhere in Europe and toasting Rashford's return to form.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have a Rashford video coming up tomorrow, hopefully, where I could try and dissect where we think he'll fit into Villa's system, because I guess that's the biggest unknown at the moment. Really unsure at the moment about where he's going to play. I've spoken to a few people in the lead up to the game on Sunday. Obviously, he'll probably play centre forward on Sunday if he starts, because Watkins is going to be unavailable by the looks of things. But long term, I'm just really not sure where he's going to fit into that system. So that's going to be an interesting one. So keep an eye out for that podcast coming up in the next 24 hours. Just finally, before we let you go, Jonathan, it's honestly been brilliant to have you on. I can't believe I've not thought to get you on sooner. Absolutely ridiculous behaviour from me, but we'll definitely be having you on again. That's for absolute certain. Adrian Doyle's asking, looking to the summer, are there any players in Ligue that you would like to see Villa keep an eye on or sign? I love stuff like this. This is right up my alley.
It's a loaded question, because normally, I can sort of reel off five to 10 different names, who I think, would do well, if Villa were looking at them and potentially eyeing them up for the summer. I don't know if, given that I don't know how it's going to work out with the January signings, it's probably a little bit too early to pinpoint sort of like one exact talented at this moment in time. But the one thing that I will say is, Ligue now more than ever, is a selling league. The clubs, all of them, including PSG, are under sort of financial duress. And I think there's never been a better time for European clubs or clubs playing in European competition with a bit of money to go fishing in France. And if Villa were to potentially base a lot of their next transfer campaign around Ligue 1, which is something that's definitely possible, because Monchi kind of made at least part of his reputation by raiding French clubs over the years with Sevilla. I think it would be a smart decision, because a bit of money can go a long way in France at the moment in terms of, some of the very talented players that we have, playing in the league. If I had to pick one player who I think would be a really smart get for Villa at this moment in time, it's really easy, because he's a free agent in the summer. It would be Jonathan David, because I think that kind of caliber of striker, especially as we're not entirely sure what will happen with Rashford beyond the end of the season, to me that would be an extremely smart move, because then if you suddenly look at the dynamic of the January transfer window with a view to the summer one, you've turned Duran from a sort of 25, 30 million player to a sort of minimum kind of 75 million player in the deal that was done. you potentially have the option to maybe bring somebody like Rashford back, either on a more long-term loan or possibly permanently if things work out. But if you've got David lined up already, you've got sort of that second really top quality striker who's in excellent goal scoring form and certainly now looks ready to make the next move in his career. So for me, he'd be the player that I'd be lining up at the moment. But the other thing that I would say is that Lille, in my opinion, have left themselves really, really vulnerable. They have a very, very good season so far in the Champions League, picked up some really unexpected.
Yeah, they have.
They're playing some excellent football under Bruno Genesio. And if, Villa were to look at the likes of Angel Gomez, possibly even at Edon Jagrova, because this summer he'll be into the final 12 months of his contract, there are some very good deals to be done with some of the top talent that Lille have at this moment in time. But if I was to just pick one name and one name only, I think it would be Jonathan David.
It sounds like Lille have just completely forgotten that you can renegotiate contracts with players that are already there. Since you've reeled off 3 players there who between them have got about 15 months left on their contract. That's a strange situation to be in. In the comments here, we've had Phil actually haven't had the best track record with Ligue 1, have they? But last time they raided Ligue 1, they ended up getting relegated, and probably the less said about Morgan Sanson, the better. So actually, Villa haven't got a great track record with Ligue 1 generally.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's difficult to sort of argue, I guess, with the evidence of the last couple of years. The one thing that I would say about that team that got Villa relegated, unfortunately, is some of the players individually have gone on to do better things. Obviously, some have kind of gone on to just stay kind of off the radar. Jordan Amabi's career wasn't really ever the same after that. But you've had guys like Veretout, who's still doing well and is at Lyon now. And obviously Gallagher as well, did well enough to sort of move to PSG and then has come back to the Premier League as well. So it's, fingers crossed that ultimately Ligue will send some of its better talents Villa's way. The record or the return, at least from some of the players that come directly from France, will be a bit more positive in the future. But I don't think necessarily that sort of that kind of period, especially the Remy Gard era, is maybe the best to judge in terms of Villa's kind of affiliation with French-based talents.
Yeah, we've got people in the comments that remember Didier 6 as well. I don't quite remember that, but yeah, Villa not got the best history with French players. It's fair to say. But Jonathan, I'll let you go. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. I'm sure everyone that's watched and will go on to watch and listen has thoroughly enjoyed hearing your views, and 100% we'll get you on again. It doesn't just have to be about French football. We can get you on any time to talk Villa. So if you're happy to come on again, we'll definitely have you on again, mate.
I'd be absolutely delighted to come on. So yeah, let me know sometime before the end of the season, and I'd be delighted to make another appearance. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me on. And like I said at the beginning of the show, great to kind of rekindle the Sky Sports connection here for Villa purposes.
Really is. I'm used to seeing you like 100 times bigger on the big screen at Sky Sports rather than seeing you on a small screen on my laptop. So it's been something a bit different today. Once again, thank you to Jonathan for joining us, and thank you to everyone that's watched and listened. Do subscribe with your post notifications on YouTube, and if you're listening via Apple Podcast or Spotify, leave reviews, give 5 stars, things like that. They really, really help. Be back tomorrow with 2 videos. I think going to link up with Jacob and do a podcast on where Rashford might fit in, and also we'll have a match preview with Dave Reed looking ahead to the FA Cup tie against Spurs on Sunday. So stay with the channel. Have a great rest of your Thursday, and as ever, up the Villa.